always believed my sister would protect me. Until I found out she told my husband I was having an affair. She wanted my life, my house, my name, my place beside him. I tried to stay calm, but what she didn't know is I don't lose quietly. Before I go any further, there's something you should know. Behind every story like this one, there's a real person, someone who feels, understands, and gives voice to what others have lived through. These words weren't created by chance. They were shaped by human hands, written with empathy and guided by truth. Because behind every story you hear, there's always someone real. My name is Marina Vaughn, and to most people, I was the picture of stability and grace. For years, I lived the kind of life people envy from afar. A classic house in Brookstone Heights. Bright gardens groomed like stage scenery. A husband admired and respected. Neighbors who smiled a little too widely because they wanted, perhaps, a glimpse of what they thought was perfection. Our life seemed untouchable, smooth, calculated, and enviably calm. Julian, my husband, was everything a woman of my age was supposed to stand beside. Measured, dependable, charming in an understated way. He was the kind of man who could fill silence with comfort, who didn't need to say much to make you feel safe. We shared a rhythm that made outsiders believe we were effortless. Sunday brunches, charity banquets, quiet mornings where the coffee was always poured before I asked. And most nights ended with soft music and laughter echoing down the hall. There was comfort in the predictability of it until there wasn't. The house itself carried a presence. Polished oak floors that slept under morning sunlight. The faint scent of roses drifting from our garden. The muted hum of the city parked at a respectful distance. Sometimes, when I walked past the full-length mirror in the hallway, I'd catch a glimpse of myself reflected there, calm, serene, composed, and think, this is what security looks like. But security, I've learned, is often just the calm before collapse. And then there was Renee, my younger sister. 5 years apart, yet she always felt decades behind me, chasing, copying, trying to catch my reflection and wear it like her own. She had a restless energy, a gleam that people found intoxicating at first and exhausting soon after. Growing up, she wanted what I wanted, wore what I wore, practiced my signature out of curiosity. I thought it was affection. I thought it was harmless. We were sisters. Wasn't that supposed to be our kind of love? Renee began visiting more often that year. She'd appear unannounced, her perfume preceding her through the door, vanilla with a trace of spice, sweet but intrusive. She moved around my kitchen as if it were her own, chatting with Julian while I cooked. Sometimes she arrived with wine for the three of us, sometimes with stories too flattering to feel sincere. Her lipstick prints began appearing on my glasses, her laughter echoing through my walls long after she was gone. I told myself she was lonely. That's the lie most of us tell ourselves before we discover betrayal. Tell me in the comments where you're watching this from. I wonder how many of you have met someone who hides their hunger behind a smile. The truth is, I used to adore Renee's energy. She had that spontaneous spark I sometimes lacked, that sense of youth that made even routine moments seem alive. I liked that she could make Julian laugh. I told myself that was healthy, that a happy home meant sharing joy. But happiness, I discovered, has shadows. And sometimes, when I'd walk into a room mid-conversation and find Julian suddenly quiet, or Renee's laughter fading too fast, I'd feel a pinch of something I didn't want to name. Suspicion is a seed you can't unplant once it takes root. Looking back, there were tiny signs, too subtle for anyone else to notice. The way she leaned a little closer when he spoke. The way her compliments about our life came with a hidden blade. I wish I could have what you have, she'd say wistfully, then add, maybe someday. Her words carried that melody of admiration laced with resentment. Still, I refused to see it. The price of peace, I suppose, is often blindness. There's a photograph still framed in our hallway, my last birthday before everything changed. I'm in a deep red silk dress, looking completely at ease. Renee stands beside me in ivory, a soft smile on her lips. Her arm rests over my shoulder. At first glance, we look like sisters sharing joy. But if you stop and look closer, you'll see it too. Her eyes aren't smiling. They're observing, almost rehearsing. That night, she raised her glass and said, "Two sisters who share everything." It drew laughter back then. Now it feels like a prophecy I failed to understand. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that the thought of their betrayal felt impossible? It's a blindness created by love, the most dangerous kind. I had no reason to doubt her or him. Not yet. But something started to shift between Julian and me soon after. Conversations shortened, touches felt performed, silences grew longer. He began watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. I asked once what was wrong. He smiled and said, "Nothing." But his eyes didn't follow the curve of his smile. One evening, after a tiring charity dinner, I remember standing in front of the mirror, unpinning my hair. In the reflection behind me, Julian sat on the edge of the bed, distant, scrolling through his phone. The quiet felt sharp. "Are you all right?" I asked. He hesitated before replying, "I'm fine, Marina." Just thinking. The way he said it, too casual, too careful, made something inside me shift. I couldn't name it, but I would later realize it was the sound of trust, slowly fracturing. Have you ever walked through your own home and felt like a guest? That's how it began. The rooms I loved, the dining table, the curved staircase, the sunlit kitchen, started to feel borrowed. The air carried a tension I couldn't trace, as if something whispered just out of reach. Yet Renee kept appearing, smiling, helpful, attentive. And I, unaware of the game she was already playing, kept letting her in. If you were in my place, what would you have done? Would you confront her then and there? Or wait quietly, patiently, pretending not to notice the shift in the light, the silences behind smiles, the tremors before the quake? I didn't know it yet, but the first lie had already been spoken. Somewhere between two whispered words and a missing truth, Renee had begun rewriting my story in Julian's mind. And soon, he would believe her. Renee had always been the kind of woman who made entrances. Not grand ones. She was far too calculated for that, but deliberate ones. She'd arrived just late enough to be noticed, just early enough to seem considerate. She dressed to compliment, never to compete, or so I believed. Looking back now, every outfit she chose for our gatherings was a study in strategic proximity. Ivory beside my red, soft beside my sharp. She wasn't dressing to impress the room. She was dressing to replace me in it. It started with small things, the kind you'd feel foolish mentioning aloud. A comment here, a glance there, nothing that could be held up to the light and called cruelty. But cruelty, I've learned, rarely announces itself. It moves quietly, in borrowed compliments and half-finished sentences. Renee was a master of the almost insult. "That dress is so you, Marina, so classic, so safe." She'd smile before I could react, and the room would move on, leaving me holding something I couldn't name. She began noticing Julian in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not overtly, never overtly, but she'd remember details about him that surprised even me. His preferred wine vintage, the name of his college roommate, the specific way he liked his steak prepared at the club on Ridgeway. At first, I was touched. It felt like devotion to our family. Then, one evening, Julian mentioned something Renee had told him about a mutual friend, and I realized she'd been having conversations with my husband that I wasn't part of. Parallel conversations, parallel intimacy. Tell me in the comments, have you ever noticed someone quietly memorizing your life? It's unsettling in a way that's almost impossible to explain to someone who hasn't felt it. It doesn't feel like theft at first. It feels like attention. The microaggressions sharpened around the same time our social calendar grew busier. We were invited to the Whitmore Foundation Gala, a prestigious evening that Julian and I attended every year. Renee had never shown interest before, but that year she asked to join us. "It would be so good for me to network," she said sweetly. I agreed without hesitation. What I didn't expect was the version of Renee who arrived that night. Hair swept up in a style uncannily similar to mine from the previous year. Wearing a gown in the same deep jewel tone I'd mentioned weeks earlier. Julian noticed I caught the flicker in his eyes, but said nothing. Neither did I. Some things feel too petty to say and too heavy to ignore. At the gala, she orbited Julian with the kind of effortless attention that looked accidental to everyone else. Laughing at his stories, touching his arm briefly when she made a point, steering him toward people she knew he admired. I watched from across the room, a champagne flute cold in my hand, and felt something shift in my chest. Not jealousy, not quite. Something colder. The dawning recognition that someone was rehearsing a role. My role. What would you have done in that moment? Would you have pulled him aside? Said something sharp and clear? Or would you have done what I did, smiled, crossed the room, and taken his hand as if nothing had happened? I chose grace. I chose silence. I told myself it was confidence. Now I wonder if it was simply the first surrender. The weeks that followed carried a new texture. Renee's visits became more purposeful. Always timed, always warm, always leaving something behind. A scarf on our coat rack. a book she'd accidentally left on the kitchen island. Small, territorial gestures disguised as forgetfulness. Julian would pick them up, set them aside, never comment. But I noticed. I notice everything. I always have. One afternoon, I came home earlier than expected from a lunch appointment. The house was quiet, Julian was traveling for work, but I could smell Renee's perfume in the front hallway. Faint but unmistakable. That vanilla and spice signature of hers hanging in the air like a question I hadn't asked. I checked every room. Nothing seemed disturbed. Nothing was missing. But the perfume was real, and it lingered in our home long after any reasonable visit should have ended. I stood in the middle of our living room, breathing it in, and felt the first cold finger of real suspicion trace my spine. I said nothing that evening when she called to chat. I laughed at her jokes, asked about her week, wished her good night, but something inside me had quietly closed a door. Not loudly, I would never give her that satisfaction. I simply began watching, listening in a different register, cataloging the tiny fractures in her performance with the patience of someone who understands that the truth, if you wait for it without flinching, always surfaces on its own. And then came the dinner party at the Calloway house. 12 guests, 3 courses, candlelight so soft it blurred every edge. I watched Renee lean toward Julian across the table and whisper something that made him go completely still. He didn't look at me. He reached for his wine glass, took a long sip, and stared at the centerpiece for just a moment too long. When I asked him later what she'd said, he smiled and told me it was nothing, just a joke about a colleague. But his jaw was tight when he said it, and his eyes found the floor just a fraction too quickly. That was the night I stopped believing in coincidence. There's a particular kind of silence that follows betrayal, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that hums at a frequency only you can hear. I began noticing it everywhere, in the slight pause before a friend answered my calls, in the carefully measured warmth of women who had once been effortlessly familiar. Something was moving through my social circle like smoke under a closed door, invisible, shapeless, but impossible to ignore once you'd caught the scent. It started with Caroline Whitmore. We'd known each other for 11 years, shared tables at every important event, exchanged birthday cards without fail, spent lazy Sunday afternoons at the club comparing notes on everything from garden renovations to marriage. She was the kind of friend who never filtered herself, which was precisely why I valued her. So when she greeted me at Patricia Ellison's afternoon tea with a smile just slightly too careful, just slightly too composed, I felt it immediately. Something had changed in the air between us. She hugged me warmly, but the hug ended a second sooner than usual. I told myself I was imagining it. Women of our world were raised to smooth discomfort into elegance. Perhaps Caroline was simply tired or distracted by her own concerns. I poured my tea, joined the conversation, and performed the version of Marina Vaughn that everyone expected, composed, witty, effortlessly present. But throughout the afternoon, I caught fragments, a glance exchanged between 2 women, when I mentioned Julian's name. A conversation that stopped just a beat too deliberately when I approached a small group near the garden window. The room was performing for me, and I was the only one who didn't know my lines. Have you ever walked into a room and felt the conversation rearrange itself around your presence? That feeling like walking into a party where you're both the guest and the subject is something I wouldn't wish on anyone. Tell me in the comments if you've ever felt it, because once you recognize it, you can never unfeel it. The second signal came from Diana Mercer, our neighbor 3 houses down, a woman whose discretion was legendary and whose loyalty I had always trusted. She stopped me one morning while I was collecting the mail, her expression carefully neutral in the way only practiced social women can manage, and said, almost too casually, "Marina, you know I adore you. And I hope you know that whatever people say, I always come to you first." She squeezed my hand, smiled, and walked away before I could form a single question. I stood at the end of my own driveway, holding unopened envelopes, feeling the world tilt slightly beneath my feet. Whatever people say, those 3 words followed me into the house, through the kitchen, up the stairs, and into my thoughts for the rest of that day. What were people saying? And more importantly, who had given them something to say? I poured myself a glass of water, stood at the kitchen window, and watched our garden in silence. The roses were in full bloom. Everything outside looked exactly as it should. But inside, something had irreversibly shifted. I began constructing a quiet inventory of recent interactions. The way Julian had grown distant over the past few weeks. The way Renee always seemed to know just slightly too much about the tensions in our marriage. Tensions I had never shared with her openly. A comment she'd made at dinner the previous month suddenly resurfaced in my memory. "Julian seems like the kind of man who'd be devastated by disappointment," she'd said, almost to herself, swirling her wine. I'd dismissed it as an odd observation. Now it felt like a blueprint. What would you do if you realized someone had been quietly poisoning your reputation while wearing your trust like a coat? Would you confront them immediately? Or would you do what every instinct in my body told me to do? Stay absolutely still, give nothing away, and begin gathering the kind of evidence that cannot be argued with. I chose the latter. Because I understood something fundamental about women like Renee. They are most dangerous when they believe they are undetected. The moment they sense exposure, they pivot, they deny, they cry. I wasn't ready to give her that exit. I called Caroline back that evening, keeping my voice light and warm, and steered the conversation gently toward our mutual social circle. I didn't ask directly, I never would. Instead, I listened to what she avoided saying, noted the topics she changed too swiftly, felt the outline of the unsaid pressing against every careful pause. By the end of the call, I had confirmed what I already suspected. A story was circulating about me, a story involving another man. A story so specific and so plausible that even people who loved me were beginning to hold it up to the light. I hung up the phone and sat very still in the dark of our study, the city humming distantly beyond the window. My hands were steady, my breathing was even, but my mind had already begun its work. Cold, methodical, precise. Because I now understood that I wasn't dealing with gossip. I was dealing with a campaign. And at the center of it, wearing ivory and smelling of vanilla, was my sister. The question was no longer what she had done. The question was why, and how deep the plan truly went. Because something told me the lie about an affair was only the surface. Beneath it, something far more calculated was waiting to be found. The confirmation didn't come the way I expected. I had imagined, in my darker moments of anticipation, that the truth would arrive dramatically. A confrontation, a slip of the tongue, a tearful confession. Instead, it arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, quietly, through a slightly open door and a phone conversation never meant for my ears. Julian had come home early from a board meeting. I was upstairs in the sitting room adjacent to our bedroom, reading or attempting to. I heard his voice below, measured and low, the cadence of someone navigating a difficult conversation with deliberate calm. I didn't move. Something instinctive told me to remain perfectly still, to let the silence carry his words upward. And it did. She told me herself. David, I mean. She told me directly. She said Marina had been seeing someone, a colleague, that it had been going on for months. A pause, then I don't know what to believe anymore. I set my book down with the care of someone disarming something explosive. My hands were completely steady. I remember that detail because it surprised me. No trembling, no sharp intake of breath, just a cold, crystalline clarity settling over everything like the first frost of winter. She told me directly. There was only one she in our world who would have delivered that particular story to Julian with enough conviction to unsettle him. Only one person who had access to both his trust and my life in equal measure. Renee, have you ever had a moment where everything you suspected snapped into focus at once? Where the fog lifted and what remained was almost unbearably clear? That was my Tuesday afternoon. Standing at the top of our staircase, one hand resting lightly on the banister, listening to my husband doubt me because of a lie my sister had placed in his ear like a slow-acting poison. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been betrayed by someone who had every reason to protect you instead? I didn't go downstairs. Not immediately. I returned to my chair, picked up my book, and waited until I heard Julian end the call and move toward the kitchen. Then I counted to 60, smoothed my expression into something serene and unhurried, and descended the stairs as though I had heard nothing. We shared a quiet dinner that night. He was distracted, I was performing. The distance between us felt engineered because it was Renee had built it, brick by careful brick, with words she had no right to speak. That night, after Julian fell asleep, I lay in the dark, reconstructing every conversation I'd ever had with Renee about my marriage. Every confidence I'd shared, every frustration I'd voiced in the safety of sisterhood. I had told her things I'd told no one else, the occasional loneliness, the weeks when Julian and I moved through the house like strangers, the small arguments that left residue. I had handed her the architecture of my vulnerabilities, and she had used every measurement to build her lie. The affair she'd described to Julian wasn't random fiction. It was constructed from the bones of my real life, shaped to be believable, designed to land. The rage I felt was not hot. I want to be clear about that. It was not the kind that rises fast and burns out quickly. It was the cold, structural kind. The kind that reorganizes everything inside you into something harder and more precise. I didn't cry. I didn't rehearse what I would say to her. I simply began, in the silence of that bedroom, to think. Because Renee had made a critical miscalculation. She had underestimated the patience of a woman who has nothing left to lose by taking her time. What would you have done at that moment? Confronted Julian immediately, called Renee, and demanded answers. I understand the impulse. But I also understood something Renee did not, that a woman who acts from emotion gives her opponent every advantage. I needed to know not just what she had done, but why. Because the lie felt too deliberate, too architecturally precise, to be motivated by simple jealousy. There was something underneath it, something practical, and I intended to find it. The following morning, I began asking quiet questions. Not to Julian, not yet. To the edges of our world, the peripheral figures who notice things without being noticed themselves. Our housekeeper, Alina, mentioned that Renee had visited twice while I was traveling the previous month, once staying for nearly 3 hours. Our accountant's assistant, a sharp young woman named Grace. Let's slip that someone matching. Renee's description had called the office, asking general questions about estate planning for couples. And Patricia Ellison, during a casual lunch, mentioned that Renee had asked her, seemingly in passing, whether she knew anything about the property values on our street. Each piece was small. Each piece was deniable. But assembled together, they formed the outline of something that made the betrayal exponentially more sinister than a sister's jealousy. Renee hadn't simply wanted Julian's affection or my social standing. She had wanted access, financial, legal, physical access to everything Julian and I had built together. The lie about the affair wasn't an act of passion. It was the opening move of a calculated scheme. And as I sat with that understanding, settling, cold, and permanent in my chest, I realized that what I was dealing with wasn't heartbreak. It was a hostile takeover. And I had only just begun to understand the full scope of the plan she had already set in motion. There is a particular kind of power in being underestimated. Renee had spent years watching me manage our world with visible grace. The dinners, the social obligations, the careful maintenance of our reputation, and she had mistaken my composure for passivity. She believed that a woman who preferred elegance over confrontation was a woman who wouldn't fight back. That miscalculation would cost her everything. I began my investigation the way I approached everything that mattered methodically, without urgency, without a single visible crack in my exterior. To the outside world, Marina Vaughn was precisely as she had always been, composed, warm, socially impeccable. I attended our regular Thursday lunch at the Ridgeway Club, hosted our monthly dinner for the Whitmore Foundation Committee, and called Renee twice that week with the easy affection of a sister who suspected nothing. Each call was a performance. Each word I offered her was carefully chosen to keep her comfortable, keep her moving, keep her revealing. The first concrete thread came from Alina, our housekeeper, whom I had always treated with genuine respect rather than the performative courtesy common in our social circle. That investment paid dividends. Over coffee one morning, something I'd begun doing deliberately. Creating small moments of trust. Alina mentioned that during one of Renee's unsanctioned visits, she had found her in Julian's study, not browsing casually, sitting at his desk, going through the lower drawer where he kept financial correspondence. Alina had assumed it was authorized. She apologized with visible discomfort. I touched her hand and told her she had done nothing wrong. Inside, something cold and certain clicked into place. Tell me in the comments, have you ever discovered that someone's betrayal went deeper than you first imagined? That the wound had more layers than you were prepared to find? Because that morning in my kitchen, I understood that Renee hadn't just wanted to poison my marriage. She had wanted to position herself inside it financially, structurally, permanently. The affair lie was the lever. The real prize was access. I requested a quiet meeting with our family attorney, Philip Hartley, framing it as a routine review of our estate documents. What I actually wanted was to understand our financial exposure specifically. Whether anyone outside our marriage had recently made inquiries about our assets, our property holdings, or our insurance arrangements. Philip is a careful man, not given to drama, which is precisely why his expression shifted when I asked. He confirmed that someone had contacted his office 2 months prior, posing as a representative from a financial advisory firm, asking detailed questions about the Vaughn property portfolio. The caller had used a name he didn't recognize, but the callback number, when traced by his assistant, belonged to a prepaid phone registered at an address in Renee's neighborhood. I drove home from that meeting in complete silence. No music, no calls, no narration of what I'd just learned. I needed to sit with it to let the full architecture of her plan assemble itself in my mind without interruption. Because what was emerging wasn't the portrait of a jealous sister acting on impulse. It was the portrait of a woman in serious financial trouble, desperate enough to dismantle her sister's marriage in order to access the stability on the other side of it. And suddenly, a dozen small details I had filed away without context began to rearrange themselves into devastating clarity. Renee's apartment lease had ended the previous spring. I remembered her mentioning it vaguely and then changing the subject. Her car, a lease she'd been proud of, had disappeared from outside her building sometime in late summer. She'd declined to family events, citing work commitments, which was unusual for a woman who had always treated our social calendar as sacred. And at our last dinner together, she'd ordered nothing but a salad and water, which at the time I attributed to a diet. Now, I understood it differently. Renee wasn't watching her figure. Renee was watching her finances collapse. What would you do with that kind of information? Would you feel sympathy? The instinct to help a struggling sibling? Perhaps you would. Perhaps the better version of me might have that sympathy requires honesty as its foundation. And Renee had chosen deception over every other available path. She had not come to me struggling and afraid. She had come to me smiling, patient, and calculating, spreading a lie that was slowly dismantling my marriage while she positioned herself to inherit its ruins. Compassion, under those circumstances, would have been surrender. I began documenting everything with quiet precision. Screenshots of financial inquiries Philip's office forwarded to me, Elena's written account of what she'd witnessed in Julian's study, signed and dated. A timeline of Renee's visits cross-referenced against Julian's growing emotional distance. I kept everything in a folder on my personal laptop. Password protected, backed up to a private cloud account Renee had no knowledge of. Each new piece of evidence was a note in a composition I was preparing to perform at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right room, in front of exactly the right audience. Julian, meanwhile, was living inside the lie Renee had constructed for him. I could see it in the way he watched me sometimes, not with hostility, but with that particular sadness of a man who believes he's been wronged and hasn't yet decided what to do about it. He was waiting, I realized. Waiting for confirmation, or perhaps for courage. And Renee, I had no doubt, was feeding that hesitation carefully, keeping him suspended in uncertainty. Close enough to comfort, close enough to eventually guide. One evening, as he sat across from me at dinner, pushing food around his plate in distracted silence, I looked at him and felt something unexpected. Not anger, not hurt, but a profound, almost clinical clarity. He was a pawn in her game as much as I was. The difference was that I had figured that out. He had not. The evening, I found the final piece. I was reviewing bank statements from a joint account Julian and I maintained for household expenses. A withdrawal I didn't recognize, modest enough to be overlooked, significant enough to matter, had been made 3 weeks prior at a branch near Renee's neighborhood. Julian's signature. But the timing, the amount, and the location formed a pattern that aligned precisely with a debt collection notice I had found. Quite accidentally, in the pocket of a coat Renee had left at our house months before and never reclaimed, the numbers matched Julian had given her money, and he had not told me. The withdrawal was modest, $4,000, the kind of sum that could be explained away as a loan between family members, the sort of quiet generosity that never makes it into conversation. But I had learned, over the previous weeks, to distrust anything that could be explained away. Convenient explanations were Renee's currency. She traded in them constantly, keeping everyone around her just comfortable enough to stop asking the next question. I had stopped being comfortable, and I had no intention of stopping my questions. I called Philip Hartley again the following morning and asked him to run a discreet inquiry into Renee's financial standing. Liens, judgments, outstanding debts, anything on public record. He returned my call by end of day. What he found was not surprising, given everything I had already pieced together, but hearing it laid out in precise legal language gave it a weight that settled heavily in my chest. Renee had accumulated significant debt over the previous 2 years. A failed business venture she had never mentioned to our family, 2 personal loans in default, and a civil judgment filed against her by a former business partner. The total figure was substantial enough to explain everything. The failed business was the detail that reframed the entire story. 18 months prior, Renee had quietly attempted to launch a luxury interior design consultancy, using, I later discovered, connections she had cultivated entirely through her proximity to Julian and me. Our social circle, our event invitations, our dinner tables had been her networking platform. She had borrowed our world to build something of her own, and when it collapsed, she had been left holding debts she couldn't service and a lifestyle she could no longer sustain. Rather than admit failure, rather than come to me honestly, she had looked at my life and made a different calculation entirely. Have you ever realized that someone didn't just want what you had? They wanted to become you because becoming themselves had proven too difficult? That's what I was looking at. Renee hadn't simply grown jealous of my marriage or my home. She had built a version of herself modeled on my life, watched it fail, and decided the most efficient solution was to remove me from the equation entirely. Tell me in the comments, does that change how you see her? Because for me, understanding the why didn't produce sympathy. It produced something colder, a complete and total removal of doubt. The plan, as I now understood it, was tiered with a precision that was almost impressive. First, destabilize my marriage by planting the affair narrative in Julian's mind, making him doubt me. Withdraw from me, become emotionally available to someone else. Second, position herself as the understanding confidant, the warm, present, reliable woman who appeared while I seemed distracted or unfaithful. Third, and this was the part that required the longest breath to absorb leverage, Julian's emotional vulnerability and her own manufactured intimacy to access financial resources. Not necessarily through romance, though I couldn't rule that out. Perhaps through loans. Perhaps through becoming indispensable enough that Julian would restructure things in her favor without fully understanding why. The $4,000 withdrawal was the proof of concept. It had worked once. It would have worked again and again, quietly, incrementally, until the damage was irreversible. And if, along the way, Julian had grown distant enough from me to consider separation, well, in our social world, a divorce settlement would have produced resources Renee could orbit indefinitely. She didn't need to marry my husband. She simply needed my marriage to end, and the spoils to land somewhere she could access. What would you have done with that knowledge? I sat with it for 3 full days before I moved. Not from indecision, but from the discipline of timing. I have always believed that the most powerful response is the one delivered at the moment of maximum impact, not the moment of maximum emotion. Renee was still comfortable. Julian was still suspended in his manufactured doubt. Our social circle was still holding its polite, careful silence around the rumors she had seeded. Everything was still in motion, and I needed it to remain in motion just a little longer. During those 3 days, I made 2 important decisions. The first was to tell Julian nothing, not yet. Not because I was protecting him, but because his reaction, when the truth finally arrived, needed to be witnessed. He needed to understand what he had allowed to happen through his silence. His credulity, his willingness to doubt me based on one woman's whispered campaign. That reckoning would come publicly, where it could not be minimized or privately renegotiated. The second decision was to call Sylvia Caldwell, the most socially connected woman in our circle, and the unofficial memory of every gathering we had attended for the past decade. I invited her to a dinner party, a reconciliation dinner, I called it. A chance for our closest friends to gather, for tensions to ease, for the warmth of long friendships to restore itself. Sylvia, naturally, was delighted. She spread the invitation with the enthusiasm of a woman who understood that something significant was about to happen without knowing precisely what within 48 hours. The guest list had assembled itself. 12 people, all of whom had heard the rumors, all of whom mattered, all of whom would remember what they were about to witness for the rest of their social lives. I called Renee last. I kept my voice warm, my tone nostalgic, told her I'd been thinking about how we'd let distance creep between us, that I missed her, that I wanted our circle to feel whole again. She accepted immediately, with a brightness in her voice that told me everything. She believed she had already won. She arrived at my door that evening with flowers, white roses, which struck me as either tone-deaf or deliberately provocative, and a smile so practiced it could have been framed. She had no idea that every person in the room already held a sealed envelope from me, delivered that afternoon by hand, containing a single printed page. She had no idea what the evening would cost her. The table looked perfect. I had spent the better part of that afternoon arranging every detail with the kind of intentionality that only becomes visible in retrospect. The candles placed to illuminate faces rather than centerpieces. The seating arranged so that Renee would sit directly across from Julian. both of them framed by the people whose opinions shaped our world. The flowers she had brought, those white roses, I placed in a vase at the center of the table, where everyone could see them. A small cruelty. The first of several guests arrived in the easy, unhurried way of people who believe they are attending a simple dinner among friends. Sylvia Caldwell swept in first, reading the room with the practiced instinct of a woman who has attended 1,000 gatherings and can sense the difference between celebration and ceremony. Caroline Whitmore arrived with her husband, warm but watchful. Diana Mercer, Philip Hartley, and his wife. 3 other couples whose names carried weight in our neighborhood, all of them present. All of them carrying the sealed envelope I had delivered that afternoon. All of them instructed, in a brief handwritten note, to open it only when I asked them to. None of them had broken that instruction. One had counted on their curiosity being stronger than their impatience. I was right. Renee arrived last, which I had anticipated. She understood entrances. She was wearing a dress in deep burgundy, close to the red I had worn in that birthday photograph. Close enough to be intentional, and she moved through my front door with the confidence of a woman who believed the evening belonged to her. Julian greeted her with the cautious warmth of a man still navigating uncertainty. I greeted her with a kiss on the cheek and told her she looked beautiful. She did. I wanted her to feel that. I wanted her comfortable, at ease, entirely unprepared for what a composed woman looks like when she has finally decided to act. Tell me in the comments, have you ever smiled at someone while holding the truth about them like a card against your chest, waiting for precisely the right moment to lay it down? That is one of the loneliest and most powerful feelings I have ever known. Dinner proceeded through 2 courses, with the surface warmth of any gathering among old friends. Conversation flowed, travel, renovations, the upcoming charity auction. Renee was relaxed, laughing freely, touching Julian's arm twice in ways she believed went unnoticed. I noticed, everyone noticed, but no one moved, because everyone was waiting in the particular suspended way of people who have been told, without being told, that something is about to happen. Between the second course and dessert, I rose from my chair. The table quieted with the naturalness of people who had been quietly anticipating exactly this. I lifted my wine glass, smiled at the room at each face, deliberately, unhurried, and said that I wanted to take a moment to speak honestly, because I valued every person present too much to let a misunderstanding continue to move through our circle unchallenged. I asked them to open their envelopes. What the envelopes contained was not dramatic in presentation. It was a single printed page, a summary, written with the precision of a legal document, of everything I had discovered. Renee's financial collapse, the business failure, the debts, and the judgment. The inquiries made to Philip's office under a false name, Elena's signed account of Renee and Julian's study, the bank withdrawal cross-referenced with the debt collection notice from her coat pocket, still folded in its original crease. The timeline of her visits against the timeline of Julian's growing doubt, and at the bottom of the page, one final line. The affair never happened. There was no other man. There was only a sister who needed what I had built, and chose deception over honesty to take it. The room read in silence. That silence was the most exquisite sound I have ever heard. 12 people absorbing 12 pages of truth simultaneously. The occasional soft exhale. The deliberate setting down of paper. Renee's face moved through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, then recognition. Then something I can only describe as the specific terror of a performance collapsing mid-stage. She looked at me. I looked back at her with the calm of someone who has been waiting a very long time to be exactly here. Julian set his page down last. He didn't look at Renee. He looked at me, and what I saw in his face was not the vindication I might have once hoped for, but something more complicated and more honest. Shame. The shame of a man who had doubted his wife based on a whisper, who had accepted a stranger's story over a decade of marriage, who had handed money to the architect of his own deception without a single question asked. That shame was its own verdict. I didn't need to speak another word to him that evening. The document had done everything necessary. What followed was not chaos that would have been beneath the occasion. It was the quiet, irreversible social death that only our kind of world can deliver. Sylvia Caldwell placed her page on the table with the finality of a gavel and said, simply, "Renee, I think you should go." No one disagreed. No one softened it. Renee stood slowly, the burgundy dress she had chosen so carefully now looking like a costume from a play that had just been canceled mid-run. She looked around the table for an ally and found only the particular blankness of people who have decided, collectively and permanently, where their loyalty lies. She picked up her bag. She did not look at Julian again. She walked to the door, and I followed her, not to comfort her, not to argue, but simply to close it behind her myself, quietly, with the same calm I had carried through every moment of that evening. The door clicked shut. I stood in my own hallway, one hand still resting on the handle, and breathed. From the dining room, I could hear the soft resumption of conversation, careful at first, then warmer. Then, somewhere beneath it, the sound of something restored. I straightened, smoothed my dress, and returned to my table. Julian's chair was empty. He had excused himself to the garden. I sat down, accepted a refilled glass from Caroline, and let the evening carry itself forward, because the work was done. The truth had landed, and what remained now was simply the quiet aftermath of a storm that had finally, completely broken. The morning after the dinner, I woke before dawn. The house was completely still. That particular stillness that follows something significant, as though the walls themselves were absorbing what had happened within them. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table in the gray early light, and allowed myself, for the first time in months, to simply breathe without calculating what came next. The investigation was over. The performance was finished. What remained was the quieter, slower work of understanding what my life looked like now that the threat had been removed from it. Julian and I didn't speak that night, not really. He had come back inside from the garden after the last guests left, poured himself a drink he didn't finish, and gone to bed without a word. I didn't follow immediately. I sat in the living room for a long while, listening to the house settle, thinking about the particular loneliness of being vindicated by evidence rather than by faith. He had needed a document to believe me, 12 witnesses, a timeline, a signed statement. I had needed none of those things to remain loyal to him across a decade of marriage. That asymmetry was something I would carry for a long time, not as bitterness, exactly, but as clarity. A precise and permanent understanding of where we stood and what would need to change if we were to stand anywhere together at all. We spent the following weeks in a careful, honest reckoning, the kind that can only happen after pretense has been entirely stripped away. Julian apologized, more than once, and with the specific, unflinching accountability of a man who understood that a general apology was insufficient. He named what he had done, the doubt he had entertained without evidence, the money given without disclosure, the silence maintained when honesty might have protected us both. I listened without interrupting, without softening it for him. He had earned the discomfort of his own confession, and I respected him enough not to take it from him. Whether our marriage would fully recover was a question neither of us could answer that month. But for the first time in a long time, we were at least asking it together. Honestly, without a third presence whispering in the spaces between us. Renee did not call. Not that night, not the following week. The silence from her was its own kind of answer. Confirmation, if any were still needed. That what had driven her was never love for me or even love for Julian, but simply need. Desperate, calculated, structural need. When the plan collapsed, there was nothing underneath it. No remorse reached me because there was no relationship left to produce one. I had grieved that loss months earlier, alone, in the dark of our bedroom while Julian slept beside me, unaware of what his wife was silently carrying. By the time the dinner happened, the grief was already finished. What I felt when the door closed behind her was not sadness. It was the clean, uncomplicated sensation of something resolved. Her absence from our social circle was noted in, by the standards of our world, final. Sylvia Caldwell, who functioned as the informal arbiter of these things, had made her position clear at the table. The others followed, not cruelly, but completely. Invitations stopped. Calls went unreturned. The carefully cultivated connections Renee had built through proximity to our life dissolved with the efficiency of a frost that arrives overnight. She had borrowed our world to sustain herself, and when the borrowing was exposed, the credit was revoked. I heard, through Diana Mercer, that she had moved to another city by spring, a quieter place, a smaller life, a fresh beginning built, for once, on her own foundation. I wished her no further harm. I simply wished her gone. And she was. Tell me in the comments, do you believe in poetic justice? Not the loud, cinematic kind, but the slow, structural kind that rearranges itself so completely that the person who caused the damage simply disappears from the landscape. Because that is what happened. Not a single raised voice. Not a single act of aggression. Just truth, delivered at the right moment, to the right people, in the right room. Renee had built her plan on the assumption that I would react emotionally, that I would shout, confront, dissolve into the kind of visible distress that discredits a woman in rooms like ours. She had never considered that I might simply wait, document, and let the evidence speak with more authority than any emotion ever could. The social repair, on my end, was swift and complete. Caroline Whitmore called the morning after the dinner and spoke with the frank warmth of a woman returning to herself after a period of uncomfortable compromise. Diana Mercer arrived at my door with pastries and the particular relief of someone who had been holding a difficult secret on my behalf without fully understanding it. Our circle reconsolidated around me with the naturalness of water, finding its level, not dramatically, not with ceremony, simply by returning to what had always been true. I was Marina Vaughn. I had always been Marina Vaughn. Nothing Renee had whispered had changed that. It had only temporarily obscured it. What I learned in the long months between discovery and resolution is that betrayal of this particular kind, intimate, calculated, wearing the face of love requires a specific kind of response. Not revenge in the crude sense, not retaliation, but a refusal to be rewritten. Renee had attempted to author a version of me faithless, distracted, undeserving, and distribute it to the people whose perception shaped my world. My response was simply to insist on the original, to gather the evidence of my own truth and present it, without apology, without performance, without the trembling hands of a woman who has forgotten her own authority. Have you ever had to fight for your own story? Not with weapons or lawyers or public declarations, but with patience, precision, and the absolute refusal to disappear. That is what this was. And if you are sitting somewhere right now watching this, holding your own version of what I carried a lie told about you, a trust broken by someone who should have been your shelter, I want you to hear this clearly. Your truth is not fragile. It does not require shouting to survive. It requires only that you protect it long enough to deliver it correctly. Our house in Brookstone Heights is still standing. The roses are still trimmed. On Sunday mornings, when the light comes through the kitchen windows at the particular angle that has always made that room feel like the best version of home, I still feel the specific contentment of a life that belongs entirely to me. Julian and I are still learning what we are to each other now, honestly, imperfectly, without the comfortable illusions we once relied upon. Some mornings that feels like loss. Most mornings, it feels like something truer than what we had before. And Renee, my sister, my shadow, the woman who wanted my life badly enough to try to dismantle it, is living hers, somewhere far from here, in a world she built without borrowing mine. I hope it holds. I genuinely do. Because I am not a woman who needs her enemies to suffer. I only ever needed them to leave. And she did.